consequences of the new risks to the financial system resulting from climate change bring considerable uncertainty to policymakers. Mobilizing capital to green and low carbon investments while managing risk properly requires a substantial commitment from stakeholders in terms of organizing new data sets, building new models, and sometimes provide new regulations and requirements. From this perspective, initiatives like the central banks and supervisors network for greening this session brings together two experts, both active members of the NGFS from different stages. The first expert is Dr. Sabine Maudern, who has been member of the executive board of Deutsche Bundesbank since September 2018. In this capacity, she is currently vice chair of the NGFS and will become chair of the network in the beginning of 2024. Prior to her current responsibilities, she worked as a senior advisor as the Federal Minister of Finance and at the German Embassy in Washington. Sabine Maudern studied law in Germany and Spain and holds a PhD by the Osnabrück University. Sabine will talk about the need for central banks to deal with climate-related risk and as well as the role that the central banks can play in tackling global warming and Harvard University and published several articles in leading economic journals in the fields of information theory, macroeconomics, finance, and labor markets. Elias' presentation will focus on the difference between risks and expected outcomes related to climate policy and how this affects our understanding about the costs and the necessary urgency to implement climate environmental transition policies. Elias will also highlight the importance of clear communication to a broader public about the consequences of a late transition. So we will start the session with Dr. Sabine, then quickly move to Elias. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A session when the audience will have the great opportunity to interact with our guests. Dr. Sabine, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I do have a pretty tough task now after lunch, encouraging you to listen to me without researcher slides, but just listen, and I hope you take away what I think you should take away. So let me start. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really glad to join you today and to talk to you about the role central banks can or should play when it comes to tackle climate change. Well, before we do that, let's have a look back. And we heard this morning with Gita and others, The last few months have been really challenging for all of us, for all central banks globally. Inflation is too high in most parts of the world, and parts of the financial system were recently also thrown into turmoil in March and in April, not only in the US, but also in Europe. We experienced something. The economic outlook is somewhat uncertain, and central banks have faced a lot of criticism. So either criticism for not doing enough to control inflation, I look back to Europe, or for stifling the economic recovery through rate hikes. And I don't refer to any country at this point. Amid high inflation rates, central banks have a lot of explaining to do when it comes to dealing with climate matters. Blunt question: why should we as central bankers care about climate change if we even cannot deliver on our price stability mandate? The blunt answer is because climate risks are financial risks. Climate change and climate policies can deliver shocks to the economy and to the financial system, with potential implications for price, but also for financial stability, our core mandates. I would like to touch upon two questions for the next 10 minutes. First, how is climate change really affecting financial markets? And second, what role really do central banks and supervisors play in this regard? Climate change and climate policies pose risks to the economy and to financial markets with potential implications for prices. First, climate change will make extreme weather events more frequent and more severe, that's for sure. Brazil, for instance, is likely to going to suffer from more and longer heat waves and droughts, wildfires, floods, and storms. The impact will be felt across sectors: agriculture, fisheries, or even tourism. Extreme heat and droughts could lead to more persistent drops in productivity and rises in food prices, what we have already seen. Central and southern Brazil suffered from an extreme drought in 2021 and early 22 during the harvest season. As a result, Brazilians' agriculture's output declined by 8% in the first quarter of 22. Substantial parts of the soy harvest were lost. I read that 56% in the southern state of Rio Grande do Sul, I hope I pronounced that right. The drought drove up food prices significantly by around 8% and fueled overall inflation in 21, but up to 10%. The historic drought also put pressures on Brazil's power grid. Hydropower is the largest source of energy in Brazil. It makes up almost 2/3 of Brazil's electricity generation. In 21, water reserves of hydropower plants have dropped to the lowest level in almost a century. Brazil had to import electricity from neighboring countries. To cover the imports and to boost power generation from other sources, Brazilian's government increased electricity prices by an average of 7% in September 21. Ladies and gentlemen, these examples illustrate the impact that extreme weather events can have on the economy, and we are just at the very beginning. These risks that directly stem from global warming are referred to as physical risk, and that's one of the risks we are dealing with as central banks. Second, there are also risks that can occur as our economies are moving towards zero. We call that transition risk. Take Brazil again. While Brazil has long been a leader in renewables, especially hydropower technologies, the country is at the same time Latin America's largest oil producer. Across the globe, we will scale back fossil fuels, that's for sure. This means that fossil assets could become stranded assets. Climate policy can also create inflationary pressures. The transition towards a greener economy will require higher carbon prices. In addition, massive amounts of mineral resources like copper, lithium, nickel or cobalt will be needed. The medium-term demand for these resources is expected to exceed the supply, which will once again drive up prices significantly. Ladies and gentlemen, both physical and transitional risk can cause significant economic cost and might imply financial losses. And this shows, I think, very clearly that climate change and climate policies can affect key macroeconomic variables such as output, potential growth, employment, inflation, and much more. So naturally, central banks must pay close attention to climate-related risk to deliver on our mandates, because we are guardians of price stability and financial stability. This brings me to my second point. So clear, we do have a role, but the second question is, what can we actually do? The simple answer is, we just have to do our job. We keep prices stable, although this is not so easy, and the financial system safe and sound. Resilient financial institutions and stable prices are crucial preconditions for long-term investment that is needed to green our economies. We can lay the foundation for green transitions with according monetary policy decisions. But there's more. Climate change is non-linear. There are tipping points in the global climate system. Crossing these tipping points may lead to irreversible damages. The Amazon rainforest is one of these global tipping points. Deforestation and degradation have already severely upended the delicate balance of this important ecosystem. At the same time, the most severe effects of climate change might only materialize in the next decades. We just don't know. And this is a great deal of uncertainty about climate change dynamics and impacts, and we do have to deal with these uncertainties. Central banks have strong analytical capacities and expertise in dealing with financial risk and with uncertain trajectories for the economic outlook. Many central banks across the world are currently refining their models to better understand the impact on climate change, and that's really necessary. Since I'm also representing Europe, let me also have a closer look at the euro system. The euro system systemically includes climate change considerations in its monetary policy framework. We are implementing a comprehensive climate action plan. For instance, we have started to gradually decarbonize our carbon bond holdings in order to reduce exposure to climate-related financial risk. We practice what we preach, so we check the exposure of our own balance sheets to climate risk. March this year, the Eurosystem disclosed climate-related information on our non-monetary policy investment portfolios, as well as those of our corporate bond holdings. On the banking supervision side, we expect banks to adequately consider and to manage climate risks. Last year in the Euro system, the ECB banking supervision ran a climate stress test to assess how well banks are prepared for dealing with financial and economic risks that are stemming from climate change. By ensuring that banks prepare for climate change, central banks support green transition. And I can tell you the results from the stress testing showed that even the 120 or 111 biggest banks were not really well prepared for the shocks we estimated in regard of climate change. And that tells you what happens then to the smaller ones, right? If even the 110 or 120 biggest ones are not well prepared. Well, I also, since you really nicely mentioned it, the Network for Greening the Financial System. Maybe I just alluded to it. What is it? It is an international corporation. It was founded 5 years ago with 8 members. And what was the idea behind it? The idea behind it was that some central banks globally, 8 ones, and supervisors discovered that climate change will have strong economic effects and that we just don't know or didn't know how we're going to deal with it. We just had no clue, to be very blunt. And I would not say that we know everything right now, but what really helped is that we've grown within 5 years from 8 to now 120 central banks and supervisors. And we collaborate very closely and we exchange, nevertheless, how far a central bank is or how, at the very beginning one is. And this is, I understand, also a part of this conference today. I think it's extremely important to exchange our experiences and best practices. So the NGFS is a well-established thought leader for addressing and analyzing the impact of climate change on the financial system. Our analysis reports and handbooks provide central banks and supervisors with practical tools for dealing with climate risks. We, for example, redefined our climate scenarios that can be used for stress testing and risk management purposes. And the ECB, for example, used the scenarios of the NGFS to conduct the stress testing. So did the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, and the Banque de France, and many others as well. But the NGFS is also branching out into new fields, such as the impact of nature-related risk on the financial system. And I learned from you, Elias, that Chile is also doing a lot on this regard. Like climate change, the loss of biodiversity entails sizable risk to our economies and the financial system. The Amazon rainforest is a hotspot of biodiversity. As one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world, the Amazon region is critical for the global climate and biodiversity. It is essential that central banks gain a better understanding of nature-related risk. At the NGFS, we have also started to analyze the potential of so-called blended finance as a tool to scaling up the financing necessary for climate mitigation and, of course, also for adaptation efforts. So maybe we can allude to that later on. I would also like to discuss that with you. What we see on the one hand, central banks are dealing with de-risking the financial system, or have at least, create an awareness of the financial risk that goes in hand with the climate risk. On the other hand, one has also to question what actually is the role of the financial system to enable the transformation, because who has to finance the transformation? Certainly, maybe 10% will be financed by the public sector. These tremendous numbers we are facing, it's impossible to use only fiscal mandate. Most probably the estimation shows it's not more than 10%. So the rest has to be financed by the private sector. And we see a lot of risk into this transformation finance because investors are not sure, does it go well or not? How will be the legal framework? And so what we are now having a closer look at is how can we overcome the lack of private investments? And one of the approach is to have a closer look at blended finance. That means that you have a little bit of public money, usually in equity, and by that you trigger a lot of private investors. So this is a concept. In certain places this works, and I think it's worth to have a closer look at it. And what we will do is most probably at the COP27 we will have first ideas and a handbook, and some mandates of central banks are too lean, so they will most probably not deal with a blended finance, but there are other mandates of central banks that are broader, especially in emerging markets and developing countries, and they might be very much interested. Last but not least, we at the NGFS also step up our efforts to build up capacity and skill up staff. And that's something I would also really recommend to the audience here. It is really important that we skill up our staff because none of us are experts on climate change and the economic risk that is in that. And I do not even talk about nature-related risk, wherein we have no clue at all about that, right? So at the NGFS, what we set up is training programs, a library even, and I think it's worth also to contacting us, and maybe you yourself think of internal training programs to train your staff. So, I'm happy to elaborate more on the work at the NGFS during our discussion, so let me just finally wrap up before I hand over to Elias. If I had to describe the role of central banks in one sentence, I would say central banks are catalysts for greening the financial system. All central banks and supervisors, no matter if small or large, global south or global north, can tackle global warming, especially if we support each other. And in this spirit of cooperation, I'm looking forward to our exchange of ideas. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Sabine. I think physical risks are very clear for everybody. We can understand the physical risks, the consequences of the physical risks, especially in Brazil with the agricultural sector. But sometimes the society has some doubt about the transition risks. It is a challenge for us as central bank to explain how is the transition risks, how's the consequence of transition risks, and most important, the role of the central bank in transition risks. I think Elias can clear this message for us.
Ottavia,
so
may I just add one point, because that's so important, and for me, really an insight. You said everybody can imagine physical risk. Coming from Europe, we did not at all in the first 5 years concentrate on physical risk because we thought that's not us, right? We are not facing it. And we completely only focus on transitional risk because, we thought advanced economies only need to be prepared for all the policies, climate policies that come. So we completely underestimated the physical risk, and therefore it's so good. Now we've learned, unfortunately, we had floods killing 200 people overnight in Germany just a couple of months ago. And so now what we are doing now is we really listen very careful to you guys facing physical risk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I think the most important is understand better the transitional risks and communicate the role of the central bank in this process regarding the transitional risks. So I would like to give the floor to our colleague Elias. Elias, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Otavio. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially to share the panel with Sabine. And I can see by your face that most of you have seen this movie. And the purpose of putting this in the first slide will be slowly revealed throughout the presentation. I want to talk about how to avoid bad, really bad, I should say, macro financial scenarios from severe climate change. And I would like to start making the following question. Why is the climate transition progressing so slow? There are many reasons behind this. We could have a whole conference, and actually we are having a whole conference of this in the central bank by the end of this year. But let me highlight one that I think is very important. And it has to do with the unwillingness of the general public to pay for the costs or to vote for the measures that are consistent with speeding up this transition. And in turn, I think this results mostly from a severe underestimation, not only by the general public, but also by policymakers, of the actual costs of bad climate scenarios. So why are we in this situation? That's where I want to focus my presentation. I want to highlight 3 points that I think explain to a large part why we're here. The first is that the logic, and especially the language, that we have been using behind climate scenarios is misleading in a way that I will make very explicit. And I think this matters because words create realities and set priorities. And the way we are referring to climate effects, I think it's lowering its priority on the pecking order, of finance ministries, governments, etc. Second, the socioeconomic costs of bad climate scenarios, I think, are also severely underestimated, despite our best efforts in trying to build economic climate models that try to capture as much as possible of the underlying workings of nature. And third, and this is probably the most important, the communication to the public of the dire consequences of being late in the transition is almost non-existent. And I want to further touch upon this point by the end of the presentation. So let me go with the first point. What do I mean by the logic and language behind climate scenarios being misleading? So, I'm rather old school. I should have asked this to ChatGPT. I only asked it to the Merriam-Webster dictionary. What is the definition of risk? And this is what it comes up with. The possibility of loss or injury, someone or something that creates or suggests a hazard, the chance of loss or the perils of a subject matter of an insurance contract. So basically 2 ideas when you talk about risks. Something that is not the baseline, but has a fair chance of happening, and it's not good. That's basically what we understand colloquially as risks. And it turns out that when we, as in the central bank, for example, we released the monetary policy report a couple of weeks ago, we spend a lot of time thinking about the baseline scenario. What is the most likely path of activity, demand, inflation? And more importantly, we design the monetary policy strategy to try to make inflation converge under the baseline scenario. And then we have actually separate meetings, there are actually separate meetings, where we describe the other scenarios, which we call risk scenarios. And of course we understand them to be, something that it's on the cards, could happen, but it has lower probability. And maybe policy should be different in these risk scenarios. But let me assure you, we definitely spend much more time talking about the baseline scenario and communicating policy in the baseline scenario, as we should. This is, I think, normal. Let me contrast this with the language that we use when we refer to climate, the effects of climate change. Climate analysis by the IPCC and climate economic analysis by different organizations, and let me here also mention the excellent work by the NGFS, they ostensibly omit referring to relative scenario probabilities. And if you dig deeper into the IPCC reports, you can find the origin of this decision. It actually boils down to a paper, an old paper, 16 years ago, which is the original paper that gave the IPCC the shared socioeconomic pathways, pathways on population growth, per capita GDP, how ambitious we are in the transition to, getting away from fossil fuels. This is the paper that gives these inputs to the IPCC, okay? And I'm going to quote for the paper. The paper says, given the large number of variables and their interdependencies, we are of the opinion that it is impossible to assign objective likelihoods or probabilities to emission scenarios. So this logic has stuck. And today, whenever we talk about climate effects, we don't call it climate effects, we call them climate risks. And why do I think this matters? It matters because, again, words create realities and set priorities. I mean, think about your finance ministries in the countries where you come from. Do you think the finance minister spends the same amount of time and energy worrying about things that he or she thinks are the most likely things to happen in the next year or so, relative to the things that are in the background and that are called risk scenarios? Clearly, they don't spend the same amount of effort. Clearly, it's down the pecking order of priorities. Okay? So I think this change in language is something that we need to start thinking about. And let me give you a little bit of evidence on what I think is the baseline scenario that we are facing now. This picture, I think, is worth 1,000 words. It comes from the IPCC report, not the last meeting, actually the one in Glasgow. It shows different trajectories of global greenhouse emissions. The red area are the current nationally defined contributions that have been promised by countries after 27 years of meeting and fighting over them. Okay, this is the trajectories that are promised. And they basically say that emissions are going to increase 15% in the next 7 years. And they're roughly going to peak there, then stay flat, and then come down very slowly. What does the IPCC say that we need, for example, to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius, which is the upper bound of the Paris Agreement? Well, that's given by the blue corridors, which, as you can see, are much farther down the graph. So basically, to summarize this, we have a gap, not in the next 80 years, in the next 7 years, of between 35 to 45% in the emissions that are consistent with the less ambitious target of the Paris Accord, the 2 degrees Celsius, and the ones that have been promised. So I'm going to quote how the IPCC reacts to this gap. They say, current climate pledges to 2030 would make it impossible to limit warming to 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot, and strongly increase the challenge for 2 degrees Celsius. So I'm going to put my central banking hat again, and I'm going to try to make a baseline out of this. Do you think a reasonable baseline is to expect the 1.5 degrees of the climate accord of Paris? No way. I mean, the IPCC is telling us this is impossible. Is it the 2 degrees Celsius? When I look at this graph, and I see the promises, and they don't look consistent with that either. And let me also remark that these promises, when you double click on them, very few countries have plans. And when you click on the plans are not good. They don't have, for example, clear responsibles for delivering the reduction in emissions. They don't have meaningful carbon pricing schemes. So these are plans that are promises that are not enough and are kind of empty anyway, because they're probably not going to be realized. Okay? Now you can say, well, we know that the public sector is dragging its feet. You know, the politics around this is very complicated, but the private sector is really, pulling its weight. It's really coming forward. So let me show you this graph to put things into perspective. This is a very nice graph that the senior management of the IMF put forward not long ago. And it compares the current level of private money coming into climate change projects, either of mitigation or adaptation in emerging countries, and it compares it to the ones that we need. And the conclusion is, yes, money is getting there, faster than before, but it's at least an order of magnitude less than what we need. So when I see the public discussion dragging its feet through because of the political difficulties, and we see the private sector, getting there, but still very far from what we need, the baseline scenario looks like the stuff I showed you in the first slide of this presentation. If I am driving a car at 200 kilometers per hour, and the cliff is 50 meters away, falling off a cliff is not a risk. I mean, a risk would be a tire blowing up and the car turns around and the Deus ex machina saves us. That would be a good risk. But the expected scenario is that we're going to fall down down the cliff. And this is really falling down the cliff. Because a world with 2 degrees or 3 degrees Celsius of warming is not a world we want to live in. Let me go to the second point, which has to do with what does the economics profession is doing about this and what we can do to contribute to solving this problem. The first clarification that we have to do here is that the IPCC, for which I have enormous respect, because they gather scientists from all over the world, and they meet for several years, and they make these wonderful reports that represent the absolute frontier in science, in the earth sciences of the consequences of climate change. They ask the economists for socioeconomic pathways that are exogenous to them, and they make the climate scenarios. So for example, the worst climate scenario that they model is one where by the end of the century there are 12 billion people and the Earth has warmed by 5 degrees Celsius. That's kind of a weird scenario. Because in a world with 5 degrees Celsius, one thing we're not going to have are 12 billion people. But that's not the fault of the IPCC. That's the role of the economics profession, or the sociologists, or maybe sociologists and economists working together, right? Trying to now put the physical impacts of this into the consequences into our economies, our societies. And that's where the great work by the NGFS comes in. But as so let me tell you about the results of a widely cited study by the NGFS released not very long ago on what are the economic consequences of scenarios. And let me just to make things simple, I'm going to get the worst scenario, the one where the atmosphere actually warms by 5 degrees Celsius. The models, the suite of models, I should say, by the NGFS gives us that in that scenario, the effect on world GDP is going to be 10% lower relative to a world where there's no climate changes or they don't matter for the economy. So that number might strike you as large. But keep in mind that in the next 80 years, world output is expected to increase 5-fold. So this is world GDP today, world GDP in 2100, according to the middle-of-the-road socioeconomic pathway. So this means that in the absolute worst-case scenario, instead of multiplying ourselves by 5, we're going to multiply ourselves by only 4.5. That's it. That doesn't sound like Armageddon to me at all. And there's something unrealistic about it, right? I mean, in a 5 degrees Celsius world, do you really think the effect is going to be 10% GDP? So let's try to understand, and I should say, I mean, the NGFS is very forthcoming with this. I mean, one thing about writing models, the people who actually write them, is that they recognize the limitations. And here I'm citing a limitation that the NGFS writes in the report. The methodology does not include impacts related to extreme weather, sea level rise, or wider societal impacts from migration and conflict. So let me expand on this point a little further. What are our analytical approaches missing? On the one hand, our models have a hard time dealing with the nonlinearities and the tipping points that abound in nature. But we never model them, or very seldom model them, because they're hard. The NGFS has done some progress in this. They're starting to include nonlinearities. The second problem is that, well, climate is just one dimension of the problem. There are other dimensions. That's what there's a task force on nature now at the NGFS. There are many planetary boundaries. and we are damaging them all. And they interact with each other and amplify each other. And that's something that is very hard to model, and we don't model it. And finally, and this is the big elephant in the room, it is very hard to model the complex socio-economic interactions that get triggered when there is a massive change in climate. For example, mass migration, violence, polarization within countries, the breakdown of cooperation between countries, regime change. And if you think about it, these are all things that are already happening. In fact, I'm a big fan of history, and if you trace history, you find the following. Abrupt climate change throughout history is almost always associated with massive migration, social conflict, and societal collapse. And actually, these effects are so large that they dwarf any calculation that we can come up in terms of the standard GDP effects. So there are several examples. I don't have time to go over them. Let me just mention a couple, just the highlights. When the Bronze Age transformed into the Iron Age, it was because of a reason. There was a mass migration from Greece to Asia Minor, Egypt, the Levant, etc. This event was so deep that actually writing was lost. And we had a dark age of like 600 years. Then we have the episode of the Huns migrating because where they lived also became cold and dry, and they had to migrate, and they pushed the Germanic tribes, and you know how that story ended. There's the collapse of the Mayan civilization. There are other episodes that I don't have time to explain. But I probably know what you're thinking. Things are different now. History is very imperfect, point of reference. And I agree with you. The situation today is different, at least in 3 regards. First, climate disruptions that I describe in these episodes were much milder than the ones that we have already baked into the atmosphere. Second, all these episodes are local. This is a global phenomenon because it has to do with the carbon cycle. We are messing the carbon cycle. We are putting more CO2 in the whole atmosphere. That's going to affect the whole world. And third, all these events that I mentioned were temporary. A couple of decades is at the very long end of this range. This episode is not like that. When we hit 2100 and maybe the world is 3 degrees warmer or 4 degrees warmer, depending how well we behave, after that it's going to be even warmer. So I agree with you. History is a very imperfect mirror, but this is a cause of concern, not of reassurance. Let me just go to the third point, which is the communication of this. What and who are we communicating these consequences of climate change? So the IPCC, as I said before, enormous respect for what they do. But they write several thousand long page report. That's very technical. So they make an extra effort and they write a 100-page report called Summary for Policymakers. So let me ask you, what is the version, the 5-page version with oranges and apples that describes not only the climate or the earth sciences dimensions involved, but the impacts on human civilization that can be read by anybody in the street? What's that? Where is that report? And I've asked around, and there's no such report. We don't make reports like that. So basically, make an experiment after this talk, or when you go back home. Ask anybody in the street, what is the report that they have read about climate change? And the answer will be, I haven't read no reports. Because there are no reports for the people. So that's a proposal that I'm trying to pass through. I mean, people need to be worried because people need to be willing to pay the costs for the transition. I mean, we blame politicians, but politicians are intermediaries. They are not voting for this because their electorates don't want to vote for this. So we need to motivate the electorate by giving them something that they can read or watch in a movie that's plain and that it's, not good. They became worried. Now, I understand that a lot of people that I've talked to about this idea, they say, panic is not a good strategy. And I agree. We need to strike a good balance. The balance has to be between, on the one hand, concerning people enough so that they are willing to pay the cost and they're willing to change their habits fast. But on the same time, giving them enough hope that if they do that, then our baseline scenario won't be this car falling down the cliff, and it could be something different. So what's the concrete proposal? I think we should build a comprehensive communication plan that target different segments of the population with different strategies or different marketing products, not marketing, but communication products. And this is the most important part. It has to be sponsored, hopefully by a conglomerate of highly respected multilateral institutions. So I'm just going to throw names here. The NGFS, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD. It would be great if they could sponsor a multidisciplinary group that summarizes the consequences of how the world that we are walking into is going to look like, and then give that message to people. And let me just finish with my ultimate climate fantasy, which is to go with my wife to the cinema and see a movie that starts like this. And it says, this movie is about the future, but it is not a science fiction movie. It's a projection of climate futures according to leading natural and social scientists. These scenarios have not happened yet, and the one that materializes is entirely up to us. I think that would really resonate with people. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Elias. With
obrigado.
more 20 minutes, so before I open the floor for questions from the audience, I would like to do a question related to transition risks. Né? And the question is very open, both for Sabine and Elias. And what is the role for central banks on climate transition risks, and even for policies?
Yeah, maybe I start with that. So you alluded to the transition risk. As far as I understood, is here you've also basically concentrated on physical risk, and we in Europe and the US concentrated on transition risk. What is an interesting point of perspective? Everybody has just a close look on what happens before your house door, not further. So transitional risk, first of all, I think we have to define what is really transitional risk. A transitional risk is when policies are not early enough in place, and at some point we've reached tipping points. We have physical risks like massive droughts, floods all over the world or in particular regions, and then political decision makers see themselves to be forced to put very restrictive laws in place. And this would then cause substantial threat to the economy, because some industries might even, the whole business model might be even under pressure. So this is just, as the definition, this is transition risk when we talk about that. So what is the role of central banks when talking about transitions? First of all, it's within our mandate, especially financial stability, because this is a major threat for financial stability, the transition risk. But now we should also have a closer look at banking supervision. As far as Fernanda, I understood, is in Brazil, as in Europe and in Asia, the economy is bank-based, meaning that most of the financing is coming from banks, not from the capital market, although capital markets are developing. So that means that the banking sector plays a major role in the whole climate debate. When we now take on the risk part, so how can we de-risk this, then it's clear that we have to raise the awareness of the banking sector. You, bank, have to know your carbon footprint of your balance sheet. What does that mean? Basically, they have to know the carbon footprint of their clients. But if their clients don't know what is their footprint, so how can the bank then do that, right? So basically what our, at the NGFS, our approach would be is dealing with transition plans. What is a transition plan? A transition plan is a plan where you ask the corporate, be it a bank or be it a real economy corporate, to really write down how they're going to transfer to net zero over the next 2 decades, right? So explain how you do it, figure numbers, data, and so on. This is something we see already in the UK. The United Kingdom has implemented a law, and this says that from 2023, from this year on, all listed companies have to publish a transition plan. And so they are the first movers, I would say, but transition plans are all over, and the discussion also on the accounting standards and so on. And basically what we are thinking at the NGFS is also transition plans for the supervised banks, meaning that we ask them how they, the banks themselves, get to net zero. Now you would ask, yeah, how can they do that if they don't know how their clients transfer, right? And so it might trigger, if we ask banks in the supervision to set up transition plans, that this will even trigger transformation plans from the real economy, right? Due to the supervision.
Okay, excellent.
And maybe one last point, because that's, I think, very important to understand. Why are transition plans so important? Because what mostly is lacking for private investors, and we heard that private investment is really needed, is the information, the data, you know, about the company, about the project. And if we really force the economy to, or the corporates to publish transformation plans, then there is much more data and information available for the investors. Therefore, it's also very important.
Okay, Elias, I think it's the same question, but I would like to add, how can we improve the communication? I think it is a big challenge for the central bank. What do you think about?
So, I think I'm going to give an answer that's, I hope it's a good complement to what Sabine just said, because central banks don't all have the same mandates, right? So, of course, they all take care about price stability and financial stability. But in the case of Chile, for example, the main financial regulator is the Commission for the Financial Markets. It's not the Central Bank of Chile, okay? So within our 5-year plan that we just approved with the board, we are putting the focus of the role of the Central Bank of Chile on essentially three topics. The first one is analysis, right? Trying to forecast what will happen to our economy given, you know, the path we are walking. Then there's financial risk analysis, but as I said before, that's more on the CMF side. And we also have, this is kind of cool, our central bank, by some historical accident, actually has more responsibilities regarding the production of information. So we do the national account, for example. So what was also approved by the board was that now we're going to start exploring environmental accounts that put focus on ecosystem services. So essentially, natural capital accounts. We're going to try to develop methodologies for evaluating the ecosystem services that nature provides, which, you know, it's not easy because many of them are not traded in markets. So that's an ambitious and a project that I'm very excited. Also, let me perhaps say a little bit more about the first one, the analysis that's more related to my division. If you think about it, what do we do when we do projections? We're basically we're running a time machine, right? We feed it with information from the past, and then we try to extrapolate futures. And that's what we do. That's what projections are. It just turns out that because our main mandate today is price inflation, and inflation, and we have set as a target in Chile, for example, a 2-year ahead horizon for inflation to converge. It just happens that we have calibrated this time-traveling telescope for the next 2 years. So all we face shocks, we try to analyze them, and then we look at 2 years ahead and we say, is inflation going to converge? Yes, we're all good. Great, that's the monetary policy that we have to achieve. But that's arbitrary. I mean, if we know that, I think we know, that there is a much larger and much more significant shock that maybe is coming 5 years from now, it's kind of childish to say, no, I'm sorry, my telescope is only for 2 years. Well, I mean, the reasonable thing to do is to change the telescope, right? To go further back, get more information about the past, train, like Sabine said, train your staff so that we can make better projections of what's going to happen at a slightly longer horizon. It's not 80 years, it's just 5 or 10. And when we do that, then comes the communication challenge, which was the last question that you asked. And here I want to differentiate with what the Central Bank of Chile can do. I mean, we, of course, expect to communicate this. That's kind of the whole point of doing the analysis, because we cannot implement any, environmental policy ourselves, but we can provide the analysis. But I want to reinforce the point that I made at the very end of my presentation. For communication to be effective, it cannot come from the Central Bank of Chile, or the Bundesbank for that matter. It has to come from a consortium of international organizations that get together, set up a team, and have one version of the future that then they can share with the public, because that would be very impactful. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So we have more 13 minutes, and I would like to open the floor for audience question, many questions. Okay. Ladies first. Okay. It's okay. Okay. We have a microphone for him. Okay, ladies first.
It was imposed on me. Okay. So I have 2 short questions for both speakers. The first one, Sabine touched on the challenge it is to finance transition. And I think one of the problems we face as central bankers, we usually run the stress tests that are very long. And we end up saying, like, in 10, 20 years' time, there's going to be a lot of trouble. And banks say, well, my balance sheet will be completely different in 3 years' time. So what the heck, I'll tackle that later. But there's also the complaint of lack of projects. So it's very clear that climate financing is a market failure we face right now. So what do you think are the steps necessary to address that? Is it the government that has to come up and kind of, give out the projects, or blended finance? How the way to, bring more money about into this specific area? And again, my second point would be on the stress testing. Elias was just mentioning how maybe we should look ahead at 5 years and say, in 5 years' time there will be trouble. But the problem is, and we go back to Amir's presentation earlier, it seems societies are more present-focused. So shifting more to the present and just saying, look at how the regimes of rain are changing. Look at the droughts in Europe, in China, in Brazil. Look at the floods. This is happening, people. We have to do something about it right now. So I think the timing should be more present rather than backloaded. Just a comment.
Maybe I can answer that very quickly. Stress testing, you're absolutely right. Even in the scenarios we developed at the Network for Greening the Financial System, they are too long-term, right? And this, it was a good beginning, good starting point. We just revised them, And our goal is to have at least a maximum a 5 years perspective. That makes sense, but this will take time. And secondly, Elias, on your slide you said it, what in our stress scenario was completely underestimated was the physical risk and the dynamic it has. Because we started, in jurisdictions where physical risks were underestimated. Your second question about, what is the lack of projects, what is the role of the government, what is the role of the private sector, and so on. I'm very clear, as I said in the beginning, fiscal space will never ever be sufficient for this massive investments. And so it's crystal clear that we need the private sector involved. At the same time, we have to avoid greenwashing. So what we now see is that the supply, investors want to look into ESG labels and so on, is by far higher than the projects that are really, really sustainable or doing transformation is. So what we now have to really find is how can investors know that their money put in is really for the better, right? And that's something where we have to look at. I think transition plans pay into that, because that gives a rather insight into the company, maybe also into the projects. What I also think is that we might at some point think for institutions that have a certificate saying this project is sustainable, but not the way ESG labeling is now working, because this is not the way we should do. Maybe a last point, this blended finance thing, in the thing that how can the government be involved in the projects? I think if they just take 10% of the risk in the beginning, then this is already, then investor would definitely not run into, questioning themselves if this greenwashing or not. Of course, there's always a little risk that, the project doesn't run, but I think this would show private investors that it's worth investing it.
Yeah, so very quickly, on the first question you made, I totally agree with Sabine. Public policy funds are not enough, not to speak of, funds from NGOs or donations. Our current problem is that when we try to, for example, recover an ecosystem, or protect an area, we rely almost exclusively on donations. And the donations market is this size, and it's completely saturated. So I'm gonna cite Mark Carney here at the COP in Glasgow, where he said, we need the investor community to invest in nature. And invest means getting a return. And if you think about it, we are producing value if we recover nature. So there's gotta be a way to figure out how to make a profit out of investing in nature. And I think one very promising way, which I think Sabine mentioned earlier, is this idea of blended finance. Because with blended finance, you can use the limited public funds and funds from NGOs to design investment products that kind of lever up the investment from the private sector. We've been, this is obviously not the role of the central bank. We've discussed some ideas. There's this concept of nature-backed securities, where you invest in ecosystems and the flows are backed by different payments. We can talk about this later, but I think that's one way to go, because public funds by themselves are not going to make a difference. And you ask this very difficult question. People are very presently focused. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So what do? Two options. Like, I think, is it Thomas Aquinas who said, to see is to believe. So that will work. When the whole world is on fire, then we'll be convinced. The problem is that it's kind of late. It's not much we can do. So a real challenge is, how do we convince people that something bad, really bad, is going to happen if we keep on our current trajectory when this thing has not yet happened? And again, the only way is to travel through time through credible projections that are backed by credible institutions. I don't really see, of course, and if Quentin Tarantino were to direct the movie, that would help, I guess, but I don't really see an alternative. That's the only thing we can do.
Thank you. I think this private-public relationship, invest in nature, can be the best way to reach all goals that we are need. The next question.
Yeah, thanks very much and very nice presentation. I still, Elias, what do you want to communicate? You put a stress on we need to convince the world that there's something bad happen if we don't act. I think that's an easier story to tell because they're starting to observe that. I think the challenge is more making the link between the present and the future. Is it what do you need to do now in order to avoid that scenario that is not so impactful that I wouldn't be willing to sign up for it as an individual. And there's a lot of goodwill in some parts of the world, at least, towards this agenda, but people don't feel the concreteness, okay, this means I need to do X. So now, can we get X to be the first best? A carbon tax would take care of all these things, right? Then we don't have to start allocating to some other mechanisms the resources towards the transition and what have you. Now, we're not going to get there necessarily, but getting close to it would make a big difference. And I think there the analytical power of central banks and others is very useful, that maybe we should more of our time, and this is a question also for Sabine. I mean, I can see all these things for the ESG, and I can see the stress test, but if we don't convince them of the big picture, maybe this is not really what we should put our money into it. Maybe money is in the resources in the central bank community. Maybe we should put all our focus on convincing, laying out a scenario where you can have something as an individual to sign up for that is convincing enough that the politicians would back it up. Now, easier said than done, I understand that, but I'm sometimes getting a little frustrated saying, well, ESG is not going to work because it's already greenwashing, and by the time we get it fixed, 5 years from now, we can't wait for that. So I'm a little bit pushing you maybe back to basics to some extent, but where do we communicate on is at least one of the pieces of the puzzle that we need to answer. Maybe more a comment than a question, so you don't have to answer.
No, but maybe very quickly, I think that you get frustrated. I'm not surprised, right? Because everybody who has dealt with the subject for a couple of years, might ask, well, did we move at all, right? And if you see the figures, you know that, maybe it is already to some extent too late. But still, I think, and this is also, and has nothing to do with central bank in general, we have no choice, right? So you have to look forward, and you cannot wait till you have the perfect solution. So yes, I fully agree, stress testing, this label and this, they are small pieces, right? But if you don't start, and to be honest, our mandate is the one we have. It's not climate policy, so it's not within our mandate. So we cannot do more, even if if someone would do. But what maybe this is something I would really like all of you to bear in mind is what our role as central banks, the major role is to address the urgency of acting now towards the political decision makers. And why is this our major task? The major task of us to addressing the urgency towards the political side is because they believe in us. They, to different extent in different countries, but mainly central banks do have an extremely high credibility. And why do we have that? Is because we are not coming with emotions, we come with figure and facts. And that's, therefore, once again, please use your analytical capacities and tell them those results towards your government. This is the best you can do. And this is more when we do with ESG label and the whole stuff. So, well, thank you.
Excellent. So we have time for one more question. So, our colleague.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, for giving me this opportunity to ask a question. I am from Reserve Bank of India, heading the research department, and I am very happy to announce that a fortnight back, Reserve Bank of India published its maiden report on climate. So towards a greener, cleaner India. And it has been uploaded on Reserve Bank's website on May 3rd. And those who are interested may kindly take a look. Why I'm saying this is because both the speakers mentioned the communication challenge and how a central bank, through its analytical prowess, bring out, the aspects involved in this critical question. Having said that, one particular conclusion which we are finding in this report is that, as it is just now mentioned, we have also said how much is the funding requirement for the next 10 years for addressing the infrastructural gap which would come because of this climate risk. That is one issue which we have addressed. One, DSG modeling that we have done, environmental DSG modeling, which suggests that the impact of natural disaster comes through physical capital getting damaged, but the impact on consumption is much more pronounced than output. So some bit of consumption smoothing is required, which will require a lot of fiscal support. And given the limited fiscal space that many of the EMEs are facing, this is a critical challenge going ahead. So any thought from these speakers on this particular issue? Thank you.
It was rather a comment. Yeah. So, pardon me. First of all, I think it's a great deal, and I'm really happy that the Bank of India also joined the NGFS. Thank you so much. And the Deputy Governor of Bank of India was also at our plenary meeting and re-emphasized what you just said. So very happy. And as far as I understood, it's rather a comment, right? What you heard, yeah. So thank you very much. And as I said in my speech, it's all about collaboration, and we will not manage as Banco do Brasil, Bundesbank, or Chile Bank, or Banca di India. We really have to find a common ground, right? And it's urgent. So I'm really glad that you joined us. Thank you.
So just one word further word on the communication challenges. So if you think about it, this discussion on climate change and environmental degradation has been going on for many years, right? Decades. But it's been had between people that we called activists, many of us would call them activists, and the rest of society. And there has been no bridge between these two groups. And that means that the warnings of people who understand more about the earth sciences, that we sometimes call activists, have been largely ignored. I think what's different about this time around is that the fact that central banks and other multilateral institutions are getting into this debate creates the bridge that we need for these two groups of societies to talk to each other. Because we can sort of validate the science, say, look guys, this is real. This is happening. That explains a lot of what we're seeing in the world. Every summer when the trees burn in many countries and the heat waves. I mean, this is real. It's going to have impacts on our economy. I think central banks and multilateral institutions can be very effective at creating this bridge between two groups of society that so far have basically not talked to each other. And if I can take a minute, I would like to answer also a question by Stein on what to do. Right, so what do we know about carbon taxes? It works great in theory. In practice, it works not so well because first, that's the most certain way of assuring that you're going to have a general strike 2 weeks after you announce, an increase in petrol prices. Right, the people driving the lorries are going to block the highways, and there you are. And then they get down and they wear yellow jackets, and suddenly you have the yellow jacket movement in France. That's how it started, right? So I think a combination of a policy that goes there gradually and at the same time is accompanied by a serious investment in infrastructure that basically allows you to make the transition and allows you to substitute in a reasonable amount of time is one way to go. And the other thing that I think is kind of low-hanging fruit and we should definitely start doing, I mean, think about when you go to a supermarket. In Chile, and I'm sure in many countries, we have these stamps on food, and they say, high on saturated fats or high on calories. And this has been very effective for people to choose what to buy in the supermarket. So why don't we have the same that says, look, this has a very high carbon footprint or a very large natural capital footprint? I mean, theoretically, this can be done. The only challenge is that we need to develop these methodologies for actually calculating what are the carbon and the biodiversity and nature in general footprints of the things that we do. I think people want to, choose better. It's just that they don't know, because we have a big blind spot in how we price nature in our markets. And this would be a way, I think, of pricing nature that would help guide decisions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Elias. So time is over. I think climate-related risks is a very important and interesting issue. So the next conference we will have a full-day panel to discuss this topic and answer all questions. Now we will have the coffee break, a 20-minute coffee break. And finally, I would like to thank Sabine and Elias. Thank you very much. So let's go to the coffee break.
Pois bem, senhoras e senhores, encerramos.
just left and right, back and forth. Here go forth, forward, and backward. And you can see that. Forward. It's this here.
Good.
You can have it here. You can have
And
it
where am I? And am I sitting here?
You're sitting here. Renato will be here. Você tá aqui. Você que sabe.
So what do I need?
Deixa eu iniciar.
Everything now is within English. But then they have to make a question. But we can have one with you. Deixa eu
I have one. I'll get rid of it. Because I'm worried I'm going to forget one.
I will stay to the end. Because when Diogo finish the session, will be important.
Yeah, we have 2 other sessions.
Short session, just the closing session.
Oh.
Because Diogo is the director. But those are short sessions that you. Control freak.
O senhor já vai ficar sentado na mesa?
Acho mais simples, né?
Então eu vou anunciá-los, mas informar que já estão na mesa.
Tá bom, claro. As pessoas vão estar vendo.
É porque como era para eu anunciar e vocês virem, mas já que estão, para ficar...
Já tá ali, né? Tirar
Aí
o
eu
cara.
falo, já se encontra uma mesa, tá?
Ele perguntou se podia sentar, tá tranquila,
Não,
deixa
e
ele
os
sentar.
demais também já fizeram.
O anúncio do... Não fazia sentido você
It's
anunciar.
better that we were already sitting. We don't need to go from there
Eles não vão entender você anunciar. Então o diretor...
Oh, yeah. No, what's weird is that, I'm used to the laptop, so I just have to
Tá.
get centered on.
Esses são só os dois, né?
You wanna sit here because
Tá,
it's just in
então
front of the TV?
comecei a pedir para as recepcionistas chamarem.
Can I sit there?
Mas eu creio que aqui
Mine?
I don't. No, of course not.
o pessoal sempre esvazia mesmo, né? Então, a hora que os senhores quiserem que inicie, é só me falar. Pode começar?
Tem problema da gente trocar a posição para ele ficar em frente da TV? Ah, tá.
Vou te explicar o que eu falei. Frescura de gente acadêmica que acha que é esquerda e direita. Não tem o menor problema, do jeito que vocês quiserem. Sabe que isso aqui é uma... Pronto, eu falo a verdade.
So I have timed these slides so roughly
Só me
45
avisar, tá?
minutes.
That's perfect.
And
Se quiserem que inicie, é só me avisar.
But let me know if I'm
Yeah,
going way over.
I'm not a good chair, you know. Time is not the special thing.
I should be able to have my phone out and keep track.
Senhoras e senhores, solicitamos.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats in the auditorium. We will restart our activities.
It's pretty hard because I have a lot to say, but if I don't get questions, then I'll feel disappointed afterwards. So.
I have some questions for you.
Oh, good. See? There we go. Excellent. I won't be disappointed.
Mais uma vez.
Once more, please, we would like you to all take your seats so we can resume our activities.
Pois bem, senhora.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so continuing our session, we would like to ask this panel's members to please come. They are already here. Mr. Renato Brigias de Brito Gomes, he's the Deputy Manager for Licensing and Resolution of Central Bank of Brazil, and also Robert Townsend. He's a professor of economics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Mr. Renato has the floor.
Gentlemen, and good afternoon to our audience joining us online. So I would like to welcome you to our second keynote lecture by Professor Robert Townsend. Just an announcement, so this session is obviously in English, but the next two will be in Portuguese. So if you need the simultaneous translation equipment, please get it at the back by the end of the session. So let me now introduce Professor Townsend. He has a PhD from the University of Minnesota and did his undergraduate studies at Duke. He started his academic career at Carnegie Mellon, where he was tenured before moving to the University of Chicago. Since 2008, he has been the Elizabeth and James Killian Professor of Economics at MIT. So Professor Townsend is astoundingly prolific on a broad range of topics, having contributed decisively to economic theory, macroeconomics, and development economics. He wrote 6 books and around 100 of academic papers. Professor Townsend's early work focused on general equilibrium and mechanism design. Having noticed that the environment of villages, historical and in the developing world, resembles those of his theory models, he ventured into development economics, organizing field studies and amassing groundbreaking data. Among many other projects, Professor Townsend is currently applying his long-standing interest in monetary economics to help the design and regulation of financial infrastructures and payment systems using distributed ledger technology. His work has been a continual source of inspiration to this central bank, and I'm sure to many other jurisdictions. Professor Townsend, so thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be invited to give this talk. I really thank you for your introduction. So this talk is entitled Blueprints for Optimized Design of Financial System Using New Technologies. So what do I mean by the new technologies? These new tools are very powerful, but they have not been used that much in design issues. The new tools are ledgers, sometimes referred to as distributed ledgers, e-payments, smart contracts, and encryption. These are a big part of decentralized finance, DeFi, but the latter typically lacks optimized design. In fact, it was never put together that way. It's more the Wild West in terms of innovation. But the tools themselves are powerful despite the lack in DeFi of attention to the overall ecosystem. Just to remind you, the current problems with DeFi, sequencer privilege for proof of work, in which you're actually paying the miners to prioritize your proposed transaction with strategic delays. Scalability is an issue in proof of work. Layer 1 on the blockchain suffers from high congestion fees. There's something called fragmentation of assets, which is associated with having many blockchains, and you can't naturally learn information outside the domain of a given blockchain, either off-chain through what's known as oracles or other chains through cross-chain, due to cross-chain problems. So the oracle problem is, for example, having a third party posting information on the blockchain. There's an issue of resilience of that information, accidental or missing information. You could have a backup having multiple institutions serving as oracles, but again, there can be discrepancies and, not to mention, competing interest or conflicting interest in the oracles themselves. So with that backdrop, the issue is, again, how to use the new tools in optimizing the design of the financial system. I'm going to describe the economic approach to this problem. It's a framework for evaluation and for design questions. It's general equilibrium mechanism design, as was mentioned in the introduction. There's something called the Pareto problem, which we as economists use to generate constrained efficient allocations for an economy. It's enough to maximize a weighted sum of the objective functions of participants subject to resource constraints and incentive constraints. And then you can use the predictions of that problem to make judgments about contemporary allocations in institutions, from which flows advice for the private sector and for policymakers. That's pretty abstract, but let me just say, implementing it can allow large gains, and we have this ongoing project with the Bank for International Settlements on digital safety nets and improved risk sharing. I must say I had a little trepidation giving this talk after the previous one. It's kind of hard to think about anything else after you think about climate change. There's a little bit of a connection in this citation, namely climate change causes variation in crop yields and has repercussions on the rest of the economy. The impacts are not going to be uniform. They're hard to predict, but they're going to be heterogeneous. So platforms that allow improved risk sharing to pool those risks can have substantial benefit, and that's what this paper is showing, that voluntary participation would be pretty straightforward to accomplish given the gains. You can implement solutions to these Pareto problems via competition. That has to do with the welfare theorems. If equilibria can be achieved by competition on a single public infrastructure or on multiple blockchains, then allocations are Pareto optimal. The decentralization imagines ex-ante exchange and contracting and or ex-post exchange and spot markets. And the second theorem is that any Pareto efficient allocation can be achieved in competitive markets if you allow lump sum taxes and transfers. Now, you may be asking what I'm doing. Rather than just speculate about things that may seem to be claims without substantiation, I'm trying to show you by illustration the tools, in this case the economics, that are used for applied problems. So for those of you who know, this is a quick review. For others, just take it as proof of concept. There is something that I'm drawing on. Namely, we have an Edgeworth box that traces out Pareto optimal allocations. You, as I said, maximize weighted sum of the objective of the participants. The so-called lambda weighted sum in the middle picture is on the Pareto frontier. You can't do better without making someone else worse off. And the competitive allocation is pictured in the third graph, which if the assumptions are satisfied and everything goes well, you'll achieve one of the many Pareto optimal allocations. So this looks boring in the sense of apples and oranges, but just start relabeling things. These commodities could be digital representations of commodities. They could be digital assets, especially if we introduce time. then they're promises, so they're financial assets, digitized financial assets, and we introduce uncertainty in states of the world, then those commodities are contingent claims. I don't have to do anything to the underlying basic infrastructure of economics to make it applied. And not only that, you can handle contracts that way. The theorems extend when the fundamental commodity objects are actually contracts in themselves dealing with problems like unobserved states, for which you need flexible contracts and self-reported messages, or underlying problems like unobserved effort, moral hazard, which means we have to pay attention to incentives, and adverse selection problems, which we can deal with having menus of contracts. Okay. Now, what if things don't go well and we have market failures? The competitive equilibrium is not going to be Pareto optimal. You could have externalities or missing markets or imperfect competition, but the same framework now takes on a normative tone, which is how can you design the financial system to deal with things like externalities and missing markets so that we can attain a constrained optimal allocation overall. So this is what delivers the blueprints, not just guidance from the standard commodity space, but lessons from these failures. And I'll show you some examples later in the talk. Incomplete markets and contracts. Why are they incomplete? Surely competition across providers, if it's allowed, would naturally create a profit incentive for firms and financial providers to innovate. And the answer is no, that logic is false. Systems can get stuck because innovation often requires coordination across two providers. And if that coordination is judged to be illegal or there is no mechanism or seeding mechanism to allow it, then the economy can get stuck in an incomplete market situation. Likewise, if we don't pay attention to the lessons of competition in contracts, the contracts can end up being incomplete. And then, again, we have incomplete markets. So then the next step is, what is the role for central banks and for monetary policy in these worlds where markets are not complete for various reasons? And that creates a role for fiat money in two different ways. One is on-chain, essentially, through mechanism design considerations, and I'll show you an example later, and liquidity provision off-chain, which is more like the way the current legacy system is operating. Either way, you get guidance for monetary policy. So this kind of a long-winded overview of the economics approach nevertheless provides sort of an outline of where I'm going in the talk. And now I will focus on some of the details. But let me not forget the important issue of the technology. I'm going to show you two polar ecosystems that are used and potentially usable in application. This first one is meant to conjure up, the picture is meant to conjure up a common exchange platform. Agents enter into contracts, they have their balance sheet ledgers, they send messages which can be encrypted, they enter into the smart contract, which is suitably designed to give you a constrained optimal outcome, and that will in turn dictate transfers on the ledger. So that's kind of a using off-chain for contract execution and so on, and minimizes the transactions on the blockchain, which if you have full validation can be very costly and very time-consuming. So that's the centralized, let me just say, common public infrastructure. This is another picture, which I got from Parfin. The BCB alerted me to this, actually. This is a picture of multiple blockchains. So if you're not going to have one common public platform, you're going to have separate, maybe created by the private sector, but they're going to need to talk to each other. So Parfin has pairwise connections where they can keep privacy. There's something they called multi-bridge connections, where transactions among potentially more than two Parfin blockchains are semi-private. And finally, the public bridge that can connect any blockchain to any other and to a public blockchain, as with, for example, CBDC. And all those transactions are public. So already here, you're kind of seeing some trade-offs in terms of not fully interoperable, and how there seems to be. The more interoperable it is, the less privacy there is in the system. But I'm mainly planting seeds through these pictures, and as I go through the applications, I'll try to highlight the implications of the models and the theory for efficient allocation, and then ask whether one or the other of these technologies is the best way to go. So we're using economics to guide the choice of technologies. The first application is going to be market design. And so these pictures are of economic situations where the exchanges are required to be pairwise. The one on the left, well, my left, is VIXL triangle, where there's an absence of double coincidence of wants. So if you require, as by the way is typical in DeFi, bilateral exchanges of one cryptocurrency for another, and if the world is static like this, the outcome is the worst possible one. It's just going to be autarky. The second picture here is from Shapley-Shubik, and these vertical spikes are referred to as trading posts. So the idea is there are n assets, n monies, n objects. The last one, good end, is used as the commodity money for the whole system. And in any trading post, say I, the price of good I that's traded there relative to good end is determined by the ratio of demand to supply. Now, actually, this is like an AMM pricing rule that DeFi thinks they came up with, and it's associated with a lot of observed problems in the current DeFi markets. And in 1977, Shapley and Shubik were predicting these kinds of problems, although at the time they had no idea about DeFi. What problems? Multiple equilibria are pervasive in this setup, because to decide what to trade, you have to make some judgment or expectation about where other people are going and what they're going to be trading, as opposed to all ending up in some centralized place. That means some of these markets can be very thin and be overly influenced by, a demand or supply order. That's a liquidity problem, and likewise, that means the current participants there have a lot of market power. So these are not so good systems for pairwise exchange. On the other hand, there are market designs that work. On my screen, the title is getting suppressed, but I turned around to make sure you could see it. So Klemper, for the Bank of England, proposed auctions for securities, and it was very centralized, even though there were multiple securities being auctioned. This is a centralization on a common platform is a good thing here, because participants can weigh off substitutability of the assets in their own utility function. They're not like predetermined that they just got to get one. They have substitution possibilities embodied in the utility function, and also they have prices. So there's a budget constraint operating. On net, you can't buy more You can't have expenses larger than your revenues. So those simple ideas in a central common infrastructure can lead to implementation of competitive equilibria. So that's a system that works really well. And although it hasn't really happened yet, those systems can be coded and become operational. So that's kind of ongoing efforts. It could be decentralized in another way. Even though that it's on common public infrastructure, you could still have like dealers, like OTC markets, where the dealers are competing with one another, offering prices, trying to attract customers, and that too can lead to a good outcome. The forces are a bit different. The force working well in the centralized system is basically arbitrage, and the force that's working in this OTC setup is, with dealers proposing exchange, is something known as unblockable. Any allocation that can be blocked by a proposal of another dealer will not be sustained in equilibrium, and only unblocked allocations, which will be Pareto optimal, will be the outcome. Okay, so that's essentially static models, but trying to display good and bad market designs. And we have seen both in practice. So theory is giving us some guidance about how to construct new systems. The next topic is putting in the time, as I was mentioning, the dynamic element, and I'll show you the power of having common public infrastructure versus the miscoordination problem dynamics that can happen when we have separate non-interoperable blockchains. Okay, so this slide is forward contracts being executed on this common public infrastructure. There's a trading period, a date, initial date 0, and agent A here is endowed with this single unique asset, but A doesn't really enjoy utility from having it eventually at the subsequent trading dates, say holding dates. A wants the asset back at date 3, but really doesn't like it, has a low utility for it at dates 1 and 2. Agent B, on the other hand, would be happy to take it from agent A, but not hold it indefinitely and trade it back to agent A at date 3. And agent C, again, wants to hold the asset in the second to last date and give it back to agent B. So A is trading with B and making contracts with B, and B is making contracts with C, and all of this is happening before time elapsed. But because they're on a common ledger that allows commitments, B can make a commitment to C and enter into a contract for an asset that he doesn't yet have. But the code can keep track of that, because everything on the ledger is, there's a unique state. Now that doesn't mean we can't encrypt stuff. I'll come back to that later. But the result of this is no trade fails, because they're committed under the technology to, it's automated really, under the code. And also, there's no need for liquidity, which is a very counterintuitive notion. You don't have to hold on to something liquid in order to eventually buy something. And again, this is a bit of a leap of faith, because you have to imagine a system that is not really like the current legacy systems that we're used to. But in this case, you get to Pareto optimal allocations. Okay, what can go wrong? Suppose you have these fragmented assets. You have multiple blockchains. So this is a picture of agent 1 always trading on blockchain 1, agent 4 always being present and trading on blockchain 2, as if there were 2 locations essentially. But agents 2 and 3 are moving around as per those arrows from one blockchain to the other one. Now, what you can't see so well with the arrows is that 1 meets 2, so 1 could issue a promise to be redeemed at date 4 and trade it to agent 2. And let's suppose there's perfect commitment, so there's no reneging under these new technologies. That's not the problem here. 1 gives it to 2. 2 trades it in a secondary market when he meets agent 4. 4 holds on to it to 1 period, meeting 3, and 3 presents it back to the issuer. So this is, you know, assets being presented for redemption by third parties. Now, what can go wrong? It turns out there are multiple equilibria in this system. So if these digital assets, these high velocity, really private debt that serve as liquidity, are issued on both locations, there may be too much or too little of it. In fact, if both think that they're the only issuer providing the means of exchange in the other trading posts, then by this, you know, that will be discovered very quickly, but it's too late. There's going to be a crash. So people, regulators in particular, worry about financial stability, and here you can see a potential problem on the horizon as we have more and more of these digital assets circulating around with high velocity in the economy. But likewise, there's an answer, which is to have a smart contract that is coordinating the issue of these assets so that they both sort of hit on the right common equilibrium. And now that could happen with interoperability. I can't insist this has to happen on common public infrastructure, but the real point here is interoperability is not just a concept of one size fits all. The nature of the interoperability that will be needed depends on the application. So we provide guidance for the engineers and the technology companies in programming up these new applications. And lest you think this is too abstract, I'll just remind you that we have these problems currently in the US with the repo markets. The coordination problem takes the form of acquiring inventory from clients and carrying it into the dealer market, you know, worrying about whether the dealer is really going to want to accept your exchange of treasury for liquidity. And it's really a modern version of the same coordination problem. That's not the only thing happening on the US repo market. There are regulatory problems that limit leverage. But again, with these new technologies, you're not really needing to hold the asset as a dealer. What you're really doing is just backing it up with your reputation to honor the needs of the client if another dealer fails on the trade. And you can use algorithmic tools to maximize the flow of repo in the market. So all those things are available now. And the private sector is, and potentially the Treasury, interested in these kinds of innovations. Okay? Introducing uncertainty into the system. And contracting. So here I want to emphasize the possible need to think about the kinds of trades that are allowed. This picture is about something to do with moral hazard. Now, when we think about moral hazard, as an insurance company, it's that you've insured the client, but you don't know if the client's going to be diligent. And they may do things that make it more likely the insurance company has to pay off the indemnity. So contract theory can handle this problem. The solution is not full insurance, because then the client has no incentive to be diligent. Another solution would be, you know, just let the client be on their own and get no insurance at all, and that's not optimal either. So we know how to handle this moral hazard problem. You're not going to go back to the first best solution. This picture adds on the idea of having two principles, not just one, there's a common agent with multiple principals, but still the moral hazard problem. So what happens here is the principals who are insuring the agent will either get the premium or indemnity, both based on outcomes that are triggered probabilistically by the underlying action of the agent. So the Nash equilibrium outcome among the intermediaries will be inefficient. It will not be constrained second best. You won't get there that way. And the intuition is like this common action is like a spillover. There's an interconnection, an intimate one, between the two independently offered contracts. So competition among, even collusion among intermediaries, is not an easy. So there is guidance here that we need to register contracts, and when new contracts are proposed, there ought to be a process for seeing if the new contract is creating a conflict of interest and a distortion relative to pre-existing contracts. So again, when we just adopt this language of, great, we're going to have programmability on a central bank digital currency, okay, fine, I applaud wholeheartedly. Devoted a lot of effort to trying to help in that, but we need, moving forward, to think about what's going to be the process where new contracts are entered onto these systems. So likewise, something closely related would be trade restrictions. Now that's a bit counterintuitive, but basically if there's underlying unobserved states, then they have to be announced. The agents have to have an incentive to announce the truth. So-called truth-telling constraints are imposed. That's true in Diamond Didvig's model of bank runs, where agents are suffering from preference shocks that make them either very patient or very urgent to consume. I'm not going to focus on the bank run problem. I'm just reminding you of the underlying economic environment. Agents are given an incentive to announce whether they're patient or urgent. There's kind of an insurance, a constrained insurance in the optimal Diamond Didvig contract. The guys who are urgent are getting more money than they would if they were simply borrowing. So they're like getting an indemnity. And the agents that are patient are essentially paying a premium. But the thing is, they don't know who's going to be patient. None of them know who's going to be patient or urgent beforehand. Now, what happens if you allow trade? That creates an incentive for agents to hold out of the system. So I'm not going to join the Diamond Didvig Bank. If I turn out to be patient, I won't pay the premium. I'm going to have more resources. If I turn out to be urgent, I'm going to attract a Diamond Didvig customer because I've got more in value at home than I would have had if I had been a customer of the bank. So you kind of, quote unquote, bribe the urgent party and you break up the equilibrium. So Diamond Didvig's solution, as Jacqueline showed, is not sustainable if you're going to allow retrade. And this is a general principle of contracts. Ex-ante competition for the right to offer contracts is good. That's the standard economic intuition. But ex-post competition to cipher off clients, that's not a good thing. And again, now that we have the framework in front of us as an example, we can be mindful when we're designing the trade of contracts on these technology platforms. And in particular here, you would need, or at least it's a lot easier if you have the common platform to prevent this kind of unraveling. It's simple. You write if-then code, which means if you join the Diamond Didvig contract, you can't join another one. Separate blockchains, that's a harder problem. Somehow you have to keep track of the contracts that agents are entering into on other blockchains. Not impossible, but a different kind of interoperability that we have not yet considered. Let me come to the point about limits to competition and how this can help with design. I sort of outlined this briefly in the introduction. So it is thought that economies of scale would violate the assumptions for the first welfare theorem, and competitive equilibria are not going to be optimal. And here I'm giving you a simple example where that claim isn't true. You have a risk-sharing environment where agents suffer from IID shocks. With a common mean, the agents are risk-averse, so they would like to enter into a mutual fund to pool their risks, but there's a cost to linking up to other agents. And what happens here is, as you have more and more agents, the gains from having more of them are positive but diminishing because you've already, through the law of large numbers, gotten very close to the mean. On the other hand, the marginal cost is, per capita cost is going down. That's the symptom of increasing returns to scale, still declining marginal costs. But the parameters may be such that nevertheless marginal costs exceed marginal gains at some point, and that's the number of people that ought to be in a coalition. And again, this can be supported with an OTC competition on common public infrastructure. Other problems associated with competition, like bank runs, that I was just skirting, we do know something. In theory, Green and Lin showed how to implement a system that eliminated the bank run, and Ariel Zetland-Jones has applied that with some modifications to show how to stabilize fluctuating currencies in the DeFi markets. So again, regulators worry a lot about financial stability. They worry about runs. We have the technologies to begin to mitigate the damage from these runs. And you could do that one institution and one market at a time. Another thing that's said to be true about platforms, trading platforms, is that they involve multiple agent types. You know, in particular, buyers need sellers and so on and so forth. So that creates a kind of network externality, and the claim is often that you know, that's going to create walled gardens because we violate the assumptions of competitive markets. But it's not necessarily true. There's a paper in the conference being given to show you how a central bank with a small number of players could also help move toward the social optimum. My paper cited here, we just assumed many, many blockchains. And the solution is type-specific pricing and fees for participating on the platforms. And likewise, fire sales and erratic pricing are symptomatic of incomplete markets. Well, you have pollution, we kind of talked about in the previous session. Governments try things like cap and trade. They're trying to price the thing that's causing the damage. Here, the damage is being caused by incomplete markets, so the price has these externalities. The one way economists would say this, we need a market for the price, actually. We need a market for markets, meaning that there are many possible configurations of markets, but agents would be paying fees or be paid for the privilege of entering into a market. You need exclusivity to do that, so they can only choose one market. And if it's dynamic, you need to keep track of them so you know where they're entitled to be trading in the future. Now that may sound like Never Never Land, but the point about the new tools is they allow the commitment, even if it's made anonymous through encryption. We have the ability to track where agents are trading, and you know the code would prevent them from trading if they weren't privileged to have the right, having not bought the permit. So they can't like sneak under the fence and, you know, enter the state fair without paying the gate fee. That's one way to put the power of these technologies. So here's something I alluded to in my outline. Financial innovation doesn't necessarily solve the problem. If you start with incomplete markets, does that process complete itself, so to speak? And we have these classic papers, Pessendorfer in 1995 for coordination in financial assets, Mikowski 1980, coordination problem much more generally. You know, so in these setups, say in Pessendorfer, there's one good, but the set of assets that are currently existing is incomplete. Households can trade and intermediaries can acquire assets. Intermediaries have the power to create new assets. So this has to do with composability of contracts, adding new contracts on top of pre-existing ones in a consistent way. There is here a retail cost. This also relates to conversations about wholesale versus retail. In this case, actually reaching the household or client SME involves a cost for the intermediary, which somehow has to be borne. So these are realistic model ingredients. And what happens, again, is that there ends up being a potential coordination problem. I'll show you an example on the next slide. This creates the possibility for the public sector to need to do more. It's not enough anymore just to create common public infrastructure for private trading. You may need to kind of seed the demand or supply. You have to deal with these sort of seeming collusion concerns to allow, nevertheless, some kind of gain to coordination. The simple example here is, you know, I'll just say there are two households, there are 6 states of nature. Households have endowments over their states. They can be risk averse or risk neutral. There are only 3 core nominal assets being traded. That's not enough to span the space of returns. These intermediaries bear costs of creating new assets. Intermediary 1 can create new assets in state 1 and 2. Intermediary 2 can create assets 5 and 6. There's a gain to trade in the public of having both assets. That is more than enough to cover this retail trading cost B. But it turns out that for those costs in certain range, there can be multiple equilibria. So one equilibrium would not allow the innovation to happen, and you have a social loss. So let me say something about data systems. Optimize data rules on these platforms. And I need to refine the notion of open banking here. So in one paper about optimal credit scores, we're accessing almost like big data and artificial intelligence, accessing a very large data set and designing the contracts to offer to the public. But there is an adverse selection problem. So the problem with adverse selection is, you know, there are lemons. And if you think the car you get may be a lemon, then you probably don't want to buy. The price is low. And because the price is low, the better cars that aren't lemons drop out of the market. So with adverse selection, you see this kind of unraveling problems happen in medical care and so on. So you actually counterintuitively don't want to have an asset for every type of borrower. You want to pool, as in securitization, borrowers' risks and investors will be willing to buy the package, and you get to an optimal outcome. Now, there's a lot going on here. You're not sort of, again, a bit counterintuitive to the notion of open banking. By the way, open banking is a great idea in the sense that it prevents walled gardens. Like, clients have their data, they can share their data, potentially sell their data. It all sounds quite reasonable, but with these examples, things can go really badly. I mean, here, not all data should be shared. That can actually damage the financial market. You also need commitment somehow from the public sector to prevent new intermediaries from stepping in and doing better when they are sharing more data relative to existing. The second example is similar. There's a platform for dealers who deal with customers. They learn some information. The information is on a trading platform, and the worst possible outcome is for the trading platform to sell the information that it's acquiring from monitoring all the trades. And the intuition for that is when there's adverse selection, you really like to know who you're trading with. And so the price is the highest when adverse selection problem is the worst. So monetizing data can really have perverse consequences. So these are like, sort of warnings, if you like, about data systems. Much more thought needs to go into the optimized data system that we're going to be, collecting through PICS and other digital companies. Whoops. So then I get to money and monetary policy. This is a micro-founded model where agents are traveling about, they meet each other as on a blockchain. They're with each other long enough to enter into digital assets with credit. There's not a problem with paying back the loan under the assumption of the model, but then they leave each other to meet relative strangers. So money plays a crucial role in these economies in allowing agents to, strangers really, to trade with one another. So this is a bit of a view of the fiat money that plays a role in competitive equilibria. The first welfare theorem fails in this environment, but you can recover an optimal allocation, especially if you allow the money to pay interest. And this last slide is doing the same thing with mechanism design. So people locally on a blockchain are entering into one of these diamond DIDVIG insurance arrangements, including with the private information. They can report that in an encrypted way. If they stay local, it works out well. But if they start transiting to another blockchain, then there's a potential problem that their earlier history isn't known. So in this case, you can get fiat money to play a role in conveying the history of people's trades. This is sometimes referred to money as memory. So under these new systems, we have to sort of rethink the role of money in the economy, especially with blockchains that allow this kind of history to be encrypted and then conveyed. It doesn't mean money goes away. It means that money is not only potentially serving the usual sort of liquidity role, but it's serving this information role. So, did that again. So what I've done in my talk is I talked about these new technologies that are available and that need to be incorporated into market, contract, and financial design. These tools are ledgers, digital assets, programmability, encryption. I've offered guidance through examples of optimized design and also highlighting pending problems that will need to be dealt with. We went through static and dynamic versions of market design, went through regulation of contracts and trade and trade restrictions, the need for registries and so on, optimized ways to deal with increasing returns on platforms, and various kinds of externalities, the design of data systems, and monetary policy. So this is only the beginning. This research is not done. I mean, largely what I'm doing is connecting pre-existing literature in contract theory, mechanism design, and so on to the modern setting with DeFi and digitization and offering examples. Applying this in practice is challenging for many reasons. Models abstract away from a lot of problems. They're very good, though, at highlighting what could be done well and where potential problems might lie. In actual applications, of course, you can have multiple forces operating at the same time, and indeed, even more daunting, CBDC, the contraction version of CBDC, would be introduced is in Brazil and economies that already have legacy infrastructure. So what are we doing with these hybrid systems where we have both the current, it's not here, it's like you're designing it from scratch, and in practice, there are going to be challenges. But hopefully, these kinds of considerations would be helpful. So let me stop there. I'm almost on time.
Perfectly on time.
And that's good. At least one mission was accomplished. So I'd be very disappointed if I can't engage with you. I deliberately timed this so there's ample time for question and answers. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Professor Townsend. I'm going to open for questions now, but I just have one question. You described the power of smart contracts and of the design using DLT to solve equilibrium selection issues. You were giving the Pissendorfer example, or to prevent exposed trade. You were giving the Diamond-Dybvig example. I was wondering how informationally demanding is the design of the smart contracts that, in a sense, the planner has to have ex ante in order to prevent these unfortunate outcomes. So is it more about an illustration of what commitment can do in these economies, or there is, let's say, more concrete steps that we can use to design these institutions?
Well, in terms of commitment, that is achievable with these new tools, but that's not the only thing that can happen. Encryption, I didn't spend a whole lot of time on that, but like in an auction, you bid for the right to take the good provided by the supplier, but you may not want to reveal your bid to others, and worse, the auctioneer may actually be manipulating the outcome, seeing your private bid and telling things to the other bidder and so on. So the point of the encryption as a tool is to allow solutions that used to seem to need a trusted third party to operate without a trusted third party. So that's another obstacle to trade, and encryption kind of deals with that and so on. Market design is how to put the pieces together to achieve the best possible outcome.
And it's not too informationally demanding for the planner to...
Well, it doesn't have to be. I mean, sometimes there can be clear instances. For example, this multi-principal agent problem. You have a farmer in Mexico borrowing a loan to help finance the crop, and then you have an insurance company that's promising to pay an indemnity if the crop is low. And the combination of those two things led to the immediate failure of the insurance company. So that's a way, an example of two contracts which you could think of separately, insurance kind of separately from borrowing and lending, but they really ought to be thought together, and if they're offered by different providers, the regulators, should be aware of the interconnection. These are, though, models, right? The models are deliberately trying to simplify in order to make the points, right? If you started off with the digital real as a programming infrastructure, you could imagine just having a very few sort of basic contracts listed there at first, and that's very tempting for the reason that that's implicit in your question, right? The problem is you don't want to have too heavy of a hand. You're really setting up this infrastructure to encourage innovation. So there's a transition to be worked out.
Thank you. So perhaps we can open to the audience.
So here, please.
Question in the back.
Thank you for your speech. If I may, two more concrete or practical questions, if I may. First one is in the DeFi environment. What do you see the role of the regulator in terms of policy, the role of the central bank? If the central bank should regulate the market, should offer the service of a platform, should make mandatory that that assets that are regulated by the central bank or Securities Commission to be traded on a regulated platform, or should allow also that the DeFi environment to evolve a little bit more without regulation. And also in terms of the offer of liquidity from the central bank, do you see a role of the central bank in terms of offering liquidity on a DeFi or on a tokenized assets environment? The second one will be more specifically, if I may. I think you know well the case that we're working here in Brazil, in the case of Real Digital, and the objectives that we have here in Brazil. So for a long time now, and even lately, we have seen some policymakers all over the world and the press asking if there's a need for a CBDC, if CBDC is not an answer looking for a question still nowadays. And in our case, we have, I think, a very clear objectives in terms of offering a CBDC, which would be to offer settlement money for tokenized assets. Do you see that as an effective objective for a CBDC, or do you see also that CBDC is still an answer looking for a question?
So on the first part, I can't speak for BCB. It is a decision to be made by the bank. I know they solicited proposals under the Lift Challenge, including from blockchain companies and DeFi participants. So the idea very much was to learn and to see, what parts of those DeFi innovations could be carried on in conjunction with a potential digital real platform. Where they would draw the line, I cannot say, because I'm not a policymaker at the BCB. In terms of liquidity, my answer is no. That's my answer. My views do not represent those of the Central Bank of Brazil. The point of having, say, the common public infrastructure is that you don't need more liquidity, or indeed any liquidity, to accomplish a lot of the trade in forward contracts. So there's no sense in which the central bank has to pump in liquidity into these markets. There may be a hint of that in terms of the Pessendorfer-Mikowski example, where a public authority, but not necessarily the central bank, has to introduce an innovation that two private providers second-guessing each other don't do. That's not liquidity. per se. In terms of a question looking for is CBDC, yes, I think the world in general has wondered if CBDC is needed, have we gone too far? After all, in advanced countries, so-called, there's a lot of good regulation and pretty deep financial infrastructure, and you're simply replacing paper currency with, a digital payment. In fact, with central bank reserves, obviously it's already digital, so you do start wondering if that's enough. Although, I think there are gains for the so-called advanced economies. The applications are different. Certainly cross-border exchange is deeply needed, and these technologies can be used for that. In emerging markets, it's the words are democratization of finance, financial access, and those are sorely needed, and the LIFT challenge very much was showing how private sector companies' innovations using these new tools can be connected to what may become the digital real through contracting. So my answer is, for sure, it's not CBD searching for an answer, but to a question, but CBDC as a public programmable infrastructure can accomplish a lot of social good. It's something that's deeply needed. Did I answer all those questions? I think so.
I think you did. We have one more question. Two, in fact.
Thanks, Rob. That was very fascinating. At the same time, you showed many issues that we need to solve when we go further along this path. But at the same time, innovation and technology advances are very rapid too. And there's an error in both ways, how we proceed. And what are the things that we really know for sure, in some sense, that we should focus on, particularly on central banks? And maybe can I make an analog to in the internet? We don't know how it evolves. It's very private sector driven as well. Do you think that we learn lesson from there, that things haven't gone exactly right, that we should then in some sense apply? But what are those basic lessons? Because I'm struggling both at the BS, we're doing a lot of innovation too, but it's endless, right? Innovation is by definition. So what are the core issues? It's maybe a too big a question, but maybe you have some.
No, it's quite relevant. Thank you. I think I think for Brazil, they're going to do a pilot to try to come up with the design, but sort of on the first round. But whatever design that is, it's meant to be robust to the current set of applications that the BCB is aware of. And likewise, there are budget issues involved everywhere. These things require engineers and programming. And if I can use the fast payment system in Europe as an example, I think it was largely designed by the Italians. But there was explicit provision there to allow updates to the system. That was a very important part, very insightful part of the design. It's not as trivial as it sounds, because to allow fast, cheap instantaneous payments, you basically have to have several servers. There may be a primary server. You have to have others to prevent system failure, so you can switch over to the other ones. And then very cleverly, it's like, okay, if we do reach the point where we want to innovate because the technology has advanced, then we could implement that, shut down one of the servers, and implement it there and then switch over to the new system. So that's just an example I'm aware of where they face directly the future process of innovation.
So we get our last question now.
Yes, it's very brief. Congratulations on the talk. Would anonymity or pseudo-anonymity on market participants prevent optimal solutions?
I didn't catch the first part.
Would pseudo-anonymity prevent market first best market solutions? Like you see,
I tend to approach it the
ecosystem.
other way around, which is, let's imagine a system where privacy were not an issue and shoot for that as a target, but do it by appropriate encryption. So, multi-party computation, fully homomorphic encryption, they're very powerful tools. I mean, it's counterintuitive, but for example, secret keeping, as in multi-party computation, it means each participant's trade or balance sheet is encrypted and then added to, an encrypted version of the second person, and you can add it all up in the encrypted space, and yet at the end, get something about the aggregate. So the parties are kept anonymous in MPC in the sense that they're just nodes with private and public keys. Fully homomorphic encryption means you can operate on encrypted messages and accomplish the same outcome as if the messages were the original and non-encrypted. So again, that's also very, very powerful. It is true that when we're coming at this conversation from the perspective of blockchains, Bitcoin and then Ethereum are essentially public blockchains. And so the transactions are available to be seen, and that's a big problem in terms of preserving privacy. But it's not insurmountable. What's needed there is just a commitment, maybe through a public-private partnership, to create Ethereum EVM contracting platform that allows multi-party computation and fully homomorphic encryption to operate.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Professor Towson. So please join me in a round of applause.
Agradecemos, então, aos...
Thank you very much, Renato Diaz, Brito Gomes, and Robert Dawson for participating in this session. Thank you very much.
Pois bem, senhor...
Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin now. Continuing first our annual conference of the Central Bank of Brazil. We want to give prizes to institutions that are top 5 rank of short, medium, and long term in 2022. Their certifications will be given by the Chief of the Statistics Department of the Central Bank of Brazil, Mr. Fernando Rocha. We would ask that at the end of the ceremony, everyone that receives a prize would please come to the stage so we can take a picture. We would invite Mr. Diogo Abrigeli, Deputy Director of Economic Policy for the Central Bank. I will speak in Portuguese now. So if you need a translation, please use your headsets. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. This ceremony of top 5 is dedicated to the inflation goal. So accuracy is quite irrelevant, either for focusing on the gains of the convergence of expectations of agents. The prize recognizes publicly the relevant role that was developed by the different institutions that participate in the POP survey. Top 5 is not just a question of prestige, but it represents the importance of these institutions to the better understanding of economic institutions and of the process of monetary policy. Focus was implemented in 1995 to help the monetary policy under the inflation regimes. During this period, the system was improved several times. We had many different timelines and many different designs of the reports were modified, and even the IT platform was innovated. Currently, we have the expectations of around 160 institutions for our inflation, IGPM, and GDP, interest rates, variables, indicators of foreign trade are all captured online. Statistics that are created by this survey is published in this focus and updated every Monday on our website with historical values. We recognize our top 5 rankings. This ranks the institutions according to their how right they are in identifying the different inflation targets, and also the GDP in the short, medium, and long terms. And it's a incentive so that people can present their best estimates. In order for this the central bank has conceded the certifications to the top 5 institutions. I will call you forth, and then please come forth so I can give you the Taulis Laureate, Pactual Asset, short EPCA. Is he here? Do we have a picture? Alexandre Lohmann, Constância Investimentos, mid-term annual.
Gabriel Artung, SBX Capital. Ricardo Meirelles de Farias, Lina Galena, Consultoria Econômica, IPCA, next term. José Maurício Pimentel Batista, BBA, Asset Management, IPCA, mid-term annual.
Eliezer Rodrigues, T6, IPCA administrado de longo prazo ano corrente. Alexandre de Azara.
UBS Brazil, long-term IPCA following year.
Daniel Carpe, Banco Santander.
Daniel Carpe, Santander.
Matheus Rocha Rosignoli, Banco Safra, IGP.
Matheus Rocha, Banco Safra, long-term recurring.
Samer Xuxa, BW.
Samer Xuxa, BW.
Bruno Rezende, For Intelligence. Taxa de câmbio longo.
Bruno Rezende, For Intelligence.
Fernando Honorato. Banco Bradesco.
Fernando Honorato, Bradesco Bank.
Marcelo Rebelo Lopes, Banco do Brasil, taxa Selic, curto prazo anual.
Marcelo Lopes, Banco do Brasil.
Guilherme Martins, Banco Itaú, taxa Selic, curto prazo anual. Roberto Cesensky, Barclays, taxa Selic, curto prazo anual. Cláudio Ferraz Ferreira, BTG Pactual, taxa Selic, curto prazo anual. Leonardo de Sico Tanza, Itaú Asset Management, taxa Selic, curto prazo anual. Diego Martins Silva, Petros, Fundação de Seguridade Social, taxa Selic, curto prazo anual.
Fernando Fenolio, Wealth High Governance Asset Management, Selic rate, short-term annual. Leonardo Costa, Asa Investment, Selic rate, long-term recurrent. Telefonica, awarded by the Selic rate, will receive the certificate in a timely manner. Okay, shall we take a picture, everyone?
Nossos cumprimentos aos
Congratulations to the winners of the top 5 awards. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the first day of the annual conference of the Central Bank of Brazil. I would like to ask you to please take your seats so that we can hear from Mr. Diogo Abriguillen for his closure remarks. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure to finish the first day of the annual conference of the Central Bank of Brazil, which is an important forum for the disclosure of new studies and debates and the Central Bank. After 3 years without any events because of the pandemic, we decided to unify two of the main meetings of the annual seminar for targets of inflation that started to be held in 1999, and the annual seminar of the financial stability and banking economy. The unification and the transformation of these two in the conference, annual conference of the central bank, will strengthen the debate and increases its area of action. It is my pleasure to say a few words in the closure of this event. I would like to thank and congratulate all of the teams involved in the organization and accomplishment of this event. We know of all of your effort and dedication. On behalf of the Central Bank in Brazil, I would like to thank all of those in attendance, especially the speakers and moderators that have readily accepted our invitation to participate in this conference. This is an indispensable condition for the success of this event. It is an honor to have watched such wonderful lectures by Gita Gopinath, Robert Townsend, and all of our guests, Stajin Classes, Amin Sufi, Octavio Sabine Motor, Eliezer Bagli, um, from many different institutions. I feel blessed to have participated in this event as a moderator, but also as a participant. And in terms of promoting the themes of occurring themes, we will still have 2 days dedicated to presenting papers in an academic format. We will count on the participation of experts from several central banks and National Academy of Multilateral Organizations and big research centers in the world. We will present 37 papers chosen from among 259 works: macroeconomy, sustainability, banking economy, intermediation, financial regulation, and so on. We would like to invite everyone to participate in the sessions. The past editions of the seminars and the quality of the papers accepted to this conference excites us for the next 2 days. Some of the recent advances implemented by the central bank in Brazil in the field of transparency should be noted. A very debated topic is today in the benefits of having an autonomous central bank, which has been proven theoretically and empirically in terms of the development of the monetary policy of the public sector, allowing for the better objective of the central bank. The autonomy, the jury of the central bank, and the mandates of complementary law 179 provide more visibility to the economy and prevent the monetary policy to be submitted to non-technical injunctions. And the autonomy of the central bank in Brazil is fundamental for the economic stability of the country. I would like to talk, however, on the other side of the coin, which is accountability. The basic idea is that along with the monetary policy, we have accountability. These 2 concepts are the 2 sides of one single coin, and autonomy will be as strong as the accountability is. On one hand, we have autonomy for the compliance of the target established by the National Monetary Council. On the other hand, it is up to the central bank to explain the different factors of the economy, stakeholders of the society at large, how it has been conducting its actions to fulfill its objectives. Therefore, the transparency of the decision-making process of the central bank is fundamental for its legitimacy. In addition, the transparency, when allowing the better understanding of the actions of the monetary authority and facilitating the coordination of the expectations, also increases the effectiveness of the monetary policy. And I should also say that we have been conducting several advances in transparencies. We are using several platforms in social networks, more accessible language, trying to be up to date to the new trends of communication and reaching broader publics. We are also increasing transparency in the decision-making process of the monetary policy. First of all, we understand that we should report to the different branches of power to maintain the transparency of the communication with society, and this has been the case so far, with publications of the updates of the different models utilized in the decision-making process of the monetary policies and inboxes in the inflation reports and work sessions with a lot of details, much more than in the past, always increasing, always improving. Should also highlight the analysis sector of the central bank with the description of the elements that follow the projection scenarios and all of the processes that give support to the decisions of monetary policy. Such publications allow for a better understanding of the Monetary Policy Committee based on technical foundations and following the best international practices in the use of modeling and economic analysis, as well as the effort of the different civil servants in this process. The bigger transparency of the central bank can also be seen in the communication documents of monetary policy. In different central banks, we have different notices and reports that communicate transparently the decision-making process. Discussions of alternative scenarios and divergent hypotheses contribute to the understanding of the decision-making process. However, part of this communication is very technical and restricted to the specialized public. Recent literature has been emphasized the need of a popular language to reach society at large. So, as to fulfill this gap, we are now publishing a visual summary with the main messages of the report, followed by pictures and images. The central bank has been trying to increase the transparency of the research it develops in the different fields. This research has a fundamental role in the access to monetary policy and financial stability and monetary efficiency, providing results, economic models, and analytical tools of high quality used in the political decisions that allow for a better understanding of the important matters of the global and Brazilian economies. And in December of 2021, we have published the research agenda that orients and guides the research agenda based on the institutional mission, strategic objectives, and challenges brought forth by new technologies. The main results of the research activities are disseminated and publicized in the website of this institution, especially in the series of works for discussion that counts today with almost 600 academic works published and finance report published for 2022. And trying to bring communication closer to society, we will release in the website of the Central Bank a research blog. The purpose of that is a channel of communication of the different areas of study of the Central Bank to society. The posts that will identify the authors will cover a full range of topics presented in different styles and approaches. The fundamental purpose of the blog is to make texts be publicized in a more accessible language to the public at large. In addition, we'll have a page with the profiles of the civil servants that develop research with their areas of research and listing the published works. These innovations complement the means with which we feed our research agenda. The accountability involves not only being transparent about what we do, but trying to look for the best way to convey this information, reaching the different target audiences. The Central Bank has been advancing and will continue to advance in this direction in the future. Moving to the end of my address, I would like to remember that in the next year we will complete 30 years of monetary stability brought forth by the Real Plan and 25 years of the targets regime for Brazil that has consolidated the monetary stability for our currency. After a past of economic instability because of inflation, we are proud of this achievement, which is a result of the maturing of the Brazilian society that was followed by the improving and enhancing of our institutions. We should never forget that maintaining the stability is essential for Brazil to avoid the difficulties associated to price lack of control. Inflation disorganizes societies and disrupts the productive structure of the country, generating inefficiencies, harming economic growth, and harming the least favored parts of society. So this will allow people to make better decisions about their consumptions, investments, and savings, increasing the efficiency of the economy, favoring growth, and preventing the less favored parts of the population from being impacted by inflation. So keeping a low and stable and predictable inflation is the best contribution of the monetary policy of the central bank so that the country can grow sustainably with generation of employment and guaranteeing the maintenance of the purchasing power of the Brazilian population. Predictability in the monetary policy has been contributing to a favorable environment of growth and economic growth and economic development for benefits for society at large. The confidence and trust in the monetary policy benefits everyone when allowing, with the less cost possible, the control of inflation and the sustainable growth of the economy. The credibility of the Central Bank of Brazil and the regime of targets for the inflation are achievements of the society. Ladies and gentlemen, looking forward and recognizing the challenges to be faced, I should say that the Central Bank of Brazil will continue to base its actions on the experience and responsibility of its directors, and especially in the institutional commitment and the recognized technical capacity of its staff. Lastly, I would like to take the opportunity to invite everyone for the second edition of the annual conference of Banco of Central Bank next year. We would like to count on your essential contributions by submitting your works or by participating in the debates so that next year's event is as special as this one. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos as palavras.
I'd like to thank Director Diogo for his words and wish you all